I am David Dodge. Welcome to Green Energy Futures. Rumors of the death of the energy transition have been greatly exaggerated. So says Michael Liebreich in his Bloomberg article that calls for a major pragmatic climate reset. This is in the wake of the election of Donald Trump, trade wars, and changing geopolitical priorities around the world. Unlike some of the critics who are calling for their own climate resets and so-called climate realism, Liebreich is not abandoning ship in climate action. Not at all. He's calling for a pragmatic reset in how we do it. At the heart of it, Liebreich says we need to abandon absolutisms that suggest we need to get to 100% renewable energy now. Fossil fuels must end. We must be net zero by 2050, and the world will come to an end if we reach 1.5 degree global warming. It's not that he doesn't agree with these ideas, but he says these goals, which may not even be possible in the short term, are scaring people. They're creating polarization and ironically harming our ability to take action against climate change. We were quite taken by some of the ideas in Michael's essays, so we asked him to come on Green Energy Futures and walk us through his idea of what a pragmatic climate reset looks like. So, get your headset on and hit the couch, or go for a long walk. You're in for a wild ride and some very practical ideas for a successful energy transition. Check out our blog for a shorter story, links, and our 4-minute CKUA radio features on the Pragmatic Climate Reset. We're pleased to present our entire interview. Michael Liebreich. You're smiling.
Hello.
That's good. Good day and welcome to Green Energy Futures. And like you do in your podcast, I'll get you to introduce yourself.
Very good. So hello, David, and hello to anybody, all the audience, the cast of thousands and hundreds of thousands, who knows. So I am Michael Liebreich. I do two things. I have Liebreich Associates, which is a media business. So cleaning up my podcast, a bit of writing and some speaking. And then I have Ecopragma Capital, which is an advisory business. And we also incubated something called Pragma Charge, which I think you're going to be hearing a lot about. It's an HGV charging business, pan-European, which has got extraordinary momentum and is going to be doing amazing things. And the final bit is your audience, the wonderful audience, might know the Bloomberg output on energy and climate and so on. And that is produced by something called Bloomberg NEF. The NEF stands for New Energy Finance, a business I created 22 years ago, sold to Bloomberg, and it's now, that team is still Bloomberg NEF, doing amazing things, covering and tracking the transition to clean energy, infrastructure, transportation, et cetera, et cetera.
You have in a couple of essays in Bloomberg and a couple of episodes of your own podcast, Cleaning Up, called for a pragmatic climate reset. What are you talking about?
Okay, so what's happening out there right now, very obviously, is the narrative wars. So you've got one narrative, which is promoted heavily from the White House in the US, but also by a lot of players in the fossil fuel industry that says the transition has failed. Nada, it's failed, it's over. Forget it. It was always a foolish dream. It was always childish. Look at fossils. They are, 80% of everything still, and we have to be sensible and grown up about this and accept that we're going to use fossil. And by the way, that's not too bad, right? The other narrative that is out there and has carried us very far over the last few decades is there's a transition. The clean stuff just gets cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, and we will transition fully, and we must transition fully. And it's incredibly scary if we don't transition because, and then, fill in the blank of what is the latest scare story. And what I'm saying is, okay, at this point in time, we really have to respond to history or to the situation we're in, which is that there is this big pushback. And that narrative B, the one of an easy, quick transition and the scare stories, it just doesn't work. We've now got all the knowledge that we've got. In fact, we are doing pretty well. There is a transition. It has already almost reached peak emissions. We're no longer seeing these surging increases year after year. But of course, we've got a long way to go. But we need to be pragmatic. And I want to own that word pragmatism for the forces of the transition, right? Pragmatic is not, oh, well, there's nothing we can do. We have to put up with all of the ill effects of climate change. Pragmatic is to continue with the transition, but to make it a lot cheaper, to use the solutions that are right in front of us and not to worry about the last 5%, and to stop the political discourse that says if you don't agree with the transition, you're an evil person and you have to have your car and your boiler and your furnace confiscated and all those things. We've got to stop a whole bunch of things, and we've got to have so I call it the pragmatic climate reset.
So how do you distinguish between other pragmatic climate resets, climate realism? Once I watched your episode, I thought, oh my God, there's a plethora of these things.
Yes, I mean, sadly, so I decided that we needed a pragmatic climate reset around the end of last year, that I had the kind of phrase and everything, and I was starting to write. And my pieces that I write for Bloomberg, I mean, this is two pieces, as you say. Part one, which is, no, the people saying there's no transition are wrong, and then part two saying, but the people who want to see the transition have to sort of wake up and be sensible and pragmatic. That's 10,000 words. Right, so these things don't write themselves. And while I was writing it, first of all, Dan Yergin came out with his piece called "The Troubled Transition," very much saying there is no transition, and used the word pragmatic. And then Tony Blair came up with his piece saying that we needed to have a reset. So he stole my thunder rather. But of course, his problem is, although he uses the word as well, is that it's completely not pragmatic. So yes, we're in the pragmatic climate reset wars, and I'm determined that my sort of pragmatism will win. And but it is an important conversation, because there are people who say pragmatic is to accept that we're going to be wedded to fossil fuels, and that the only way to bring energy plenty, abundance to particularly the global south is fossil fuels. And then there's other people who are still saying, no, but what about the climate change, and what about all of the they use these extreme scenarios to paint this picture of utter catastrophe in the near term as a response. But that's not pragmatic either, for two reasons. One, it's not really backed up by the science, but also, if all you do is get a bigger and bigger allergic reaction from the people that you need to change behavior, then you're actually, not only are you not being pragmatic, you're actually slowing down the transition. You're being counterproductive. And so I called the second piece a provocation, because I kind of wanted to be right out there and in the faces of those people who think that all that is needed is more information about how terrible climate change is and how cheap some of the solutions are. And if we just beat people over the head with enough information, we will get them to fall into line. It's like, have we learned nothing? Have we learned nothing about the pushback that we see around the world?
So, Michael, because I'm somewhat of a deluded optimist, I want to start out with, you also say rumors of the death of the energy transition have been greatly exaggerated. And to explain that, you cite a bunch of facts and figures. Explain to me, please do that right off the top here.
So, rumors of the death of the transition have been greatly exaggerated. And here's why. If you believe that the transition is 1.5 degrees, which means net zero globally by 2050, then yes, I'm afraid the transition is dead. So go through your 5 stages of grief, get it over with, because we're not on track for 1.5. And, I'm somebody who said so. As soon as the report came out from the IPCC saying what it would involve, I was somebody who said, it's not going to happen. I think it's okay to try anyway. I think it's been a good use of 10 years, aiming for 1.5 degrees and net zero by 2050, because it forces you to examine every industry, every business model. It's a good exercise, right? But it's failed. But that is not the transition. The transition is eventually, at some point, getting to a low carbon or near zero carbon. I call it net zero-ish, not absolute net zero or net absolute zero, low carbon-ish. We'll get there. We will certainly get there. We'll get there without question by 2100. And the reason is burning stuff is really stupid. It's environmentally stupid, economically stupid. It's thermodynamically incredibly stupid to have a flame temperature of 2,000 degrees to heat your home to 20 degrees. It makes no sense. So we'll get off that stuff. The question is, can we get off it earlier? And we should, for climate reasons. It won't be 2050 and 1.5 degrees. And so one of the things that I did to show, because there's people saying, oh, but these clean energy, it's great that solar's cheap, it's great that wind is cheap, but these technologies are only ever additive. All new energy technologies are only ever additive. So the fact that they're growing is great, but we'll never transition because we're not going to get rid of the old stuff because, and they postulate that there's some, natural law of additivity, which is completely historically nonsense, given that, in the UK, we've gone from 42% coal in 2012 to 0 last year, right? So there's no additivity happening at the UK level. And so you would have to believe additivity, you'd have to believe that coal, our getting off coal has resulted in coal somewhere else. And that our getting off peat or our getting off firewood or our getting off charcoal has somehow resulted in them being used in the global south. It's just manifest rubbish. But what I did also was I built a model of what a transition might look like with my knowledge or my experience of how industries actually grow and develop. And I've now got a little bit of gray hair. Those who are watching on video will see. And I've been around the block a few times. And what happens is the model that says we have to reduce fossil fuel emissions by 45% by 2030, which is what we were told in 2018 by the 1.5 sort of imperative brigade. That's not how industries happen. You don't switch to digital telephony by destroying analog telephony quickly, right? If you want digital telephony, you build digital telephony and you make it better, you make it cheaper. You might have to change some of the policy environment, but eventually, when things fall into place, you'll see growth that outstrips the demand for telephony. So therefore, the center of mass switches. And that's the model that I built. I built a 4-line model of the global energy system. It's not a forecast, it's an illustration to show what I mean. So I hope that the world continues to use more energy, not primary energy, the stuff it digs out of the ground, but I would like more people to visit their relatives more, to have more cold beer, to have MRI scanners in the global south, to have warm houses or cool houses if they need air conditioning and so on. More energy services. And that historically we've done about 3%, 3 and a bit percent more demand each year for the very long term. Let's continue that. That's good for humans, good for people, right? But then you have a bit of energy efficiency. And so energy demand growth is not 3.3%, it's just 2% per year. And we should be working, we, the climate concerned, should be working to deliver that, right? Not to try and shut people down. All this degrowth is utter nonsense. We should be working to deliver, to meet that demand for energy services. And the way we do that is if clean energy just grows, not by 2% a year, but by the number I chose, 5% per year, then you have this kind of the law of geometric growth. You've got the clean energy just grows geometrically, not that fast, 5% into a market that's only growing 2%. And then you step back and look at what happens. The first thing that happens is, no, fossil fuels do not go off a cliff by 50% in 12 years as we were told they needed to, right? I'm sorry to all the people who think that's the only thing that counts as success, right? That's the transition as a Hare, 50% cut in fossil fuels immediately. It doesn't deliver that. What it does is it grows the clean from the current levels, which are about 30% of everything we do in the economy is already clean, 32%. Because you have to adjust for the sort of a lot of the fossil fuel output is actually a lot of the fossil fuels we dig out of the ground are just wasted in thermal waste. It's just heat, produces lots of heat, turning it into electricity or motion or whatever. So really, clean energy starts at 32%, and if you just grow it faster than energy demand, for the first decade you don't see very much, and then that geometric growth starts to cut in and get more and more important. And so what happens is the space for fossil fuels gets a bit smaller, then a bit smaller, then it accelerates. And by 2065, it's essentially forced off the system. So it's an illustration. I'm not saying we don't need to do anything. Don't worry, David. You and I will just sit and watch it get to, a fully clean system by 2065. I'm just saying that a much more realistic model of the transition is that the clean stuff just grows faster than demand for a very long time, partly because of new technologies, partly because of scale, partly because policymakers enable, they remove barriers, partly because of course, these ferocious cost reductions. Doesn't matter why, they just have to continue to grow, and you will see a transition. So rumors of the death of the transition have been exaggerated.
You make fine distinctions between how we're doing right now in renewable energy, which you say is actually pretty good. And you say that, clean energy and heat provide about 30, you just said 32%, I believe, of energy services. Contrast that with energy capacity, renewable energy capacity, and how that growth rate is going right now, as you see it.
Well, so I don't really look very much at capacity because it's just how can I put it? A capacity like age is just a number. Because the fact is that, you can put in a lot of wind capacity, but it only produces whatever the number is in your region, depending on how sunny it is, 15%, 20%, 24%, whatever output. And then, of course, you've got to use the output. So if all of the solar is being produced at exactly the same time and half of it is just being wasted, well, who cares what the capacity is? The nature of a system with a lot of renewables in it there'll be times of excess and there'll be times of lack. And that's not a bug. That's just the reality. And in fact, in a way, you could sum up the challenge of switching from the fossil fuel to the renewable system. The fossil fuel system, about 1/3 of the energy that you dig out of the ground gets used and 2/3 of it gets wasted. The renewable system, about 1/3 of the electricity that you produce is produced at a useful time, and about 2/3 of it is actually has to be time shifted. So either way, you've kind of got to deal with a 2/3 problem. And of course, the problem for the fossil fuel lot is that their 2/3 is incredibly damaging. Well, the whole lot is incredibly damaging, and their 2/3 of thermal waste is extremely difficult to eliminate. Whereas the clean stuff, the 2/3 that has to be shifted around, first of all of it is pure engineering word coming up, exergy. In other words, it's all electricity, which is extremely useful. 1 joule of electricity is worth a lot more than a joule of coal. And the 2/3 that has to be shifted around, well, guess what? We have technologies to do that. And it's called wires and batteries. So, in the end, that's why I say, in the end, there's just no question what wins. The only question is how fast it wins.
Now, you address a lot of points in your, not a manifesto, as you call it, in your Pragmatic Climate Reset. And right off the top, David, you talk about...
My provocation.
What is it?
My provocation.
Yes. Okay. So right off the top in your reset, you talk about how we talk about climate change, and that needs to change.
Yes. So as I've said, the main challenge is to keep clean energy growing faster than energy demand by as big a margin as possible. And so the priority is that. The priority is not to demonize fossil fuels, to demonize Shell, or to try to remove people's boilers or tell them they can't have a car or whatever, because what that does is it gets the allergic reaction, but it doesn't actually develop the supply chains, the regulatory environment, etc., to just keep clean energy growing. And so there's a change in emphasis once you see that what we're going to do is to have a clean energy system that just gets bigger and bigger and eventually squeezes fossil out of the system as the kind of overriding model for the transition. then you start saying, well, what use is, demonizing, calling people deniers, or as I say, trying to tell them that enjoy your car while you've got it because your next one is going to sound like a vacuum cleaner. How does that help, right? And the politics, I think a lot of people who are, very well-meaning and want to push and accelerate climate change, what they see is the pushback, and which is, has lost two presidential elections in a sense, that they don't see the role of climate activism and strident comments and pushing technologies. They don't see their role in creating the pushback. For them, the pushback is entirely a kind of an exogenous thing that happens to the sector, caused, if it's caused by anybody, by populist politicians, by oil and gas companies, and by right-wing think tanks. But everything is an action and a reaction, and so that narrative of pushback, it wouldn't exist. It wouldn't have the power unless there were a bunch of sort of sanctimonious folks, promoting a particularly aggressive vision of rationing and disruptive actions and being very sort of disparaging. If that didn't exist, and so look, we are where we are. I'm not going to say who's the chicken and who's the egg, right? What I'm going to say is it's not helpful. And why this is really important now, by the way, is in a sense we've reached pretty close to peak emissions. Right, that surging growth, which was a lot of it was China and so on, which has reached, either it's at a peak or it's near a peak, and it's been done largely by what I would call technocratic action. It's been in the power, in the nature of power generation, and a little bit around the fringes around energy efficiency, and also switching coal to gas. There's lots of things, but largely invisible to most people. But now what you're talking about is the next big chunks are actually going to be transportation and heating and industrial heat, which is in the workplace. People are actually going to have to change what they do. You can no longer leave it to a bunch of utility CEOs and CFOs and a bunch of people in Brussels and so on to make rules. It's now actually going to affect people, which means that you need a different level of buy-in and a different theory of change. It's not about capture a few politicians and have them regulate it because they, but nobody will really see the impact. They will see it in electricity prices, by the way, and we do. But now it's about, well, actually, I'm sorry, but we won't get there unless people go to electrified heating. So you now need people on board in a very different way. And I think that demonizing somebody and then telling them that they have to go and spend $20,000 on a switch to heat pumps, or the electric cars are absolutely fabulous, but you will have to dig up your driveway and put in a charge point. And then at the same time telling this person that if they don't agree with doing it immediately, that they're a bad person, and using, I hate the word denier. I think it's outrageous to use the language of anti-fascism, anti-Nazism to somebody who just says, well, I'm not sure that climate change is bad enough to warrant very disruptive interventions. And then suddenly you get treated like you're some kind of war criminal. I find that really, really unacceptable.
How are you doing with that advice, Michael?
In the sense of, do I follow it?
Yes.
Well, I've never called anybody a denier. I've never called anybody a denier. I just don't think it's useful. I'll call them a contrarian. If they really impretzel themselves logically in order to show that either climate change isn't happening, or we're not doing it, or we can't do anything about it, or the solutions are too, if they really go to extremes with those arguments, then I'll say, look, I can't, there's no point, you're a contrarian. There's not much point, I'm not going to, I never actually try to persuade those people anyway. I might argue with them, but the reason I would argue with a contrarian is actually for the audience. And I have got involved in lots of arguments in my day on what used to be called Twitter. I don't know if I'm allowed to say this. I now call it shitter because I won't call it X. I refuse. And it definitely has suffered the enshittification, to use Cory Doctorow's term. But I have got involved in those arguments. But what I'm really arguing for is, if there's anybody in the audience who thinks, oh, that chap sounds very clever, saying that it's the sun and renewable energy doesn't work and blah, 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 it's that undecided person that I want to show actually that these arguments, these contrarian arguments, are just pitiful little houses of cards, and that then they might sound superficially like they've worked it all out. They haven't. So it's the audience that you fight for, not the core contrarian. You can forget it.
The other thing you talk about is climate science, and you have some choice words about what's been happening with the worst case scenarios, and you say that's damaging to our efforts as well. Explain that briefly.
So this is a fight that I've been fighting, or I was very actively fighting back in 2018, 2019, over this climate scenario called RCP 8.5. And that is the most extreme scenario that is used in the climate literature to examine what happens to our planet and to, everything, to the ice, to where the mosquitoes are, to whether the penguins are healthy, to whether the crops survive, to all those things. They use this thing called RCP 8.5. And I will say, I started New Energy Finance. I became professionally involved in this in 2004. And it took me a long time. 2018, I started to ask myself, what is that scenario? What is it? Because it is essentially an energy scenario, right? It's called a representative concentration pathway, RCP, but it's a concentration of CO2 caused by my industry. So what is that pathway? And when I looked at it, I thought, hang on a second. It involves coal-fired, the use of coal, which, by the way, pretty much peaked in 2014, 2015. It's had a bit of a bump because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine driving up gas prices, but we basically have reached and passed peak coal as far as I can see. And it's supposed to grow by 7x by 2100. And you think, WTF? So you go into it, and I talked to some of the modelers, and they said, well, here's the way it works. We're going to run out of oil, but in a scenario where the world continues to get wealthy, we're still going to have need for transportation. So what are we going to do? We're clearly going to do coal to liquids, right? This is the thing that Nazi Germany did and apartheid South Africa. You don't have access to oil, but you need transportation. You go to coal for liquids, right? And I'm in a world where nobody is doing coal for liquids, right? Nobody's doing it. What they're doing is electrification of transportation. So why isn't that in your models? And these modelers said, well, because there's no peer-reviewed literature that says that's what's going to happen. And I said, well, yeah, because it's happening so fast, it isn't in the literature. So completely absurd scenario. It turns out in 2017, there's a paper by a guy called Justin Ritchie and Hadi Dolatabadi saying there isn't enough coal in the recoverable resources, recoverable coal in the planet to get to RCP 8.5. And you would think that the science community would wake up to that and say, oops. But they didn't. What they said was, tipping points and all sorts of things. And they determined to continue and sort of protect this scenario, because of course what this scenario does is it gets lots of clicks, it gets the Greta Thunbergs of the world out on the streets, it gets the grant funding and so on. And I'm not it's like I believe I'm a complete believer in climate change. I'm a scientist, and therefore I'm an understander of climate change, not a believer, because I'm an understander of climate change. But I cannot endorse, if you want to say follow the science, you have to follow the science. And if the science says that that is not a plausible scenario, you can't use it as a base case. And then they went through this whole impretzelment of themselves saying, but it's not a base case. It's a something or other and an extreme, and we've got to use this in order to test the models and so on. But you go through the literature and you see all these references to base case, and you see it being used as a base case, whether it's called an extreme high emission scenario, but which is implausible, but they don't say that, but they'll still use it as the base case. And I have a problem with that. I think that is not acceptable. So what's happened is it has now been understood. There's been a paper in, I think it was in 2020 or 2021, by two very good researchers in Nature, and they said, you know, the base case, the business as usual is not what it used to be. We can't continue using RCP 8.5. But you know what? It's still throughout the literature, still used throughout the literature. And now in the next IPCC report, there's a new scenario. They're no longer using RCP 8.5, or it now has a kind of a modern version called SSP 385. It's the same thing, right? They're not using that. They're using something that they're now just calling the high scenario. But guess what? Their high scenario is no more plausible today than RCP 8.5 was before we had lots of, you know, solar and wind and whatever. So they are still trying to use a scenario which is entirely implausible because it is worse and scarier and gets better, you know, everything. And I believe that is, I mean, it's not just, it is wrong scientifically. It is wrong morally because it gives kids climate anxiety, which the same people who promote these extreme scenarios are then the ones that say, and the kids are so anxious they don't want to have children. And you're like, but it's not, follow the science, but it's also wrong politically. And that's the point that I think I'm making in the Pragmatic Climate Reset, because the Contrarians, to give them their correct name, if they see that you've used an absurd scenario, they just say, I don't need to listen to you. I don't need to listen to any of this, because look what they're doing. They're using an extreme scenario, an implausible scenario, to scare the kids into joining Extinction Rebellion and blah, 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 to fool the politicians who, by the way, are mostly in the Western world non-STEM educated and simply not equipped to have this conversation. So they're using this scenario to, you know, to push through an agenda, and it creates this huge and easy attack surface for a contrarian to say, I don't need to listen. I don't need to listen. It's rubbish. It's all rubbish. Look what they're saying is about to happen. And that's where we are. Sadly, these scenarios, the tipping point stuff is an entirely manufactured and exaggerated conversation. And now I've got to do, just before you move me on, I've got to do the caveat to what I'm saying, right? Which is that climate sensitivity is incredibly scary, right? So what we've got is the emissions, the energy system is actually, you know, already probably at peak emissions, and it's going to decline. China has just said they're going to decline the emissions by, I think it's 7 to 10% by 2035. They will beat that easily out of the park. So we're going to see emissions falling, and that should be cause for wonderful celebration. As I've been saying, it's not. We're not on the RCP 8.5 or this high scenario, but the way the planet reacts to those emissions we will have is potentially much worse than we thought. Okay, but as a scientist, you've got to distinguish between the thing that happens is going to be smaller than we thought, but its impact might be worse than we thought. And I want good science on both pieces, instead of saying, well, if the impact's bad, we can just pretend that, you know, that we're still on this terrible scenario, because there are policy implications in terms of what is going to happen, when it's going to happen, what you do to protect yourself, the ratio between adaptation and mitigation, how fast you have to act, what new information you need, and so on. There are actual implications that potentially could misallocate literally trillions of dollars. So please, can we follow the science, but not just say it? Can we actually follow the science?
So I'm not going to say any more about that because I might set you off again. Let's move on to COP. In recent years, if you talk to average people, they'll go, well, what's happened to COP? It's being hosted by petrostates. It's being chaired by chairmen of oil companies. What the heck's going on? But you actually said kill COP a long time ago. Bring us from when you said kill COP to Paris and then to today.
Right. So it's true. In 2011, I wrote a piece for Bloomberg and I said, Yabasta, Yabasta is the rallying cry of the anti-globalists in the anti-capitalist, anti-globalists in Italy back then. And so I said, Yabasta, can we stop doing this? And the reason I said that was I was leading a team, a big team, hundreds of people, and we were tracking this incredible progress across clean technologies, wind, solar, of course, but also EVs, batteries, energy efficiency, the switch away from coal. It was pretty clear what was happening. And then there were these COP meetings. By that time, we were on COP 17, I think it was, and they had produced nothing of any use. And in fact, by doing so, they were reducing the credibility of what I was doing and what my community, the energy community, was doing. And so I have a problem with that. I don't want to be banging on about clean energy and working with all the people who know that it works, and then have this thing failing year after year to do anything useful and very high profile. We think of Copenhagen. So I said, yeah, basta, we should just stop doing this. And I have to say, 4 years later, the Paris Agreement was a resounding success. And so I had to admit, I wrote another piece called We'll Always Have Paris, because Paris is a resounding success. And, I would argue I maybe had a tiny part in the success of that, because Christiana Figueres, who became the head of the UNFCCC in the COP process, she shifted it from this top-down model, Copenhagen, where we would have a carbon budget, divide it up between the countries in some, negotiated process. How that would ever work, I don't know. And then it would be enforced, and we would then implement it for the next, however many decades, until CO2 was ground out of the system. And that failed. And it failed because no politician is going to go to a COP meeting and hand over the keys and say, okay, I've had the negotiation. I know how many, gigatons, I'm allowed. And I put that on the table and I signed the thing and said, that's it. And you can punish me if I don't do that. That's not how sovereign nations work. And what Christiana did, and there's a nice episode, by the way, of Cleaning Up, in which I talked to her about it, is make it a bottom-up system, much more like NATO, by the way. NATO says, fundamentally, we protect each other. How many troops you provide is up to you. How many tanks, how many planes, how you become part of this, how you operationalize it, is actually voluntary. And so the COP is very similar. What it says is, we're going to deal with climate change. We're going to keep it to this and that level. How you do it is up to each country. And please come back every 5 years. And very foolishly, they changed that to every year to say how you do that. So what then happened? We had Paris. We had then Glasgow, COP21, which was another triumphant COP hosted by Boris Johnson, Alok Sharma, and so on, where countries really came and they made these enormous pledges and commitments. So 90% of the global economy is committed to net zero by 2070. By the way, very consistent with my 4-line model, extraordinarily consistent, which is interesting, I think. And that's kind of enough to stay probably within 2 degrees, not 1.5 degrees, but at least 2 degrees, which is sort of recognizable economy, recognizable planet, not great for everybody, but probably enough wealth to go around to, to deal with the outcomes. That's 2 degrees by 2100. So that was Glasgow. And then what you've had since Glasgow is this pushback coming out of the White House, President Trump, but also echoing around the world. We're seeing it, not around the world, because I don't think we're seeing it at all in Asia. In Asia, they're too busy building the next generation of energy technologies around the electro stack and just going electric at a huge rate of knots. But in Europe, we're getting the pushback. The UK, we've got the Reform Party. Obviously, in Canada, Mark Carney. By the way, there's another nice episode of Cleaning Up with Mark Carney when he was back in his Glasgow after the Bank of England, but before becoming Prime Minister days. He pushed back the pushback in Canada, and of course Albanese in Australia pushed back the pushback in Australia, at least temporarily. And so, but around the world, you do see this the forces pushing against climate action, and the COPs. I'm not going to ask. I'm not going to do Yabasta again. Okay, I've learned my lesson. I'm older, wiser. That grey hair helps. But they do need to be dramatically reformed and changed in the way they operate. We cannot pretend that a COP process where the US has now pulled out twice, even if it comes back in, even if there's the pendulum swings again in American politics, and suddenly the next, President Michelle Obama or President Clooney, whoever you want in your dream world that would get the US back in, a process that is so volatile, that's on again, off again, and that is where you try to get the fossil producing countries on board by essentially handing them the keys. That process has to change. And some other things, I also make some practical suggestions, like go back to one big meeting every 5 years and much smaller meetings in between. Because when you ask a country, what are you going to do for the climate? And then they go through this huge negotiation and they produce Europe still hasn't produced the nationally determined contributions for the meeting that's in less than 5 weeks in Belém in Brazil. So they go through this entire internal negotiation of their plan, put it on the table, go away, go back home. And then it's like, well, and what are you going to do next year? Well, no, sorry, you need time to implement. The real economy has to catch up. So one big meeting every 5 years, this consensus, which means that every single country has to agree before the gavel can come down and you have an agreement. Go to majority voting. It's not binding anyway. The UNFCCC does not have armies to send in to countries who don't do what they say they were going to do. So it is only a non-binding commitment in any case. So go with majority voting and hold it. This is my idea. Hold it the four meetings before the big one. Hold them on islands with only 5,000 hotel beds, and make sure that it is, the negotiators and not, JP Morgan and, a whole bunch of oil and gas companies that get the hotel beds because they've got the big budgets. Make it work. And if it was smaller and with majority voting, make it 1 week, not 2. So dramatically restrict it in scale, scope, ambition, and make it about sectors. So have a discussion about what do we do with steel? What do we do with shipping? What do we do with the power sectors? How do we go to zonal pricing, which is absolutely essential to pass on the benefits of cheap renewables to individuals and businesses? Make it very, technocratic, but also non-binding. And then, then it would work much more closely with the IMO in shipping, or with ICAO in aviation, or the steel industry, the copper industry, and so on. And that way, I think we could have something that is extremely productive, in the finance sector as well. You can have something productive. But this mission creep, they now want to add in even more forestry and even more biodiversity and even more issues and so on. That doesn't create more of a push for action. It might create more of a push for action, but it also makes action virtually impossible. So strip it down, focus it in, make it non-binding, make it manageable, and you've got something that could be extremely valuable. We definitely should not Yabasta get rid of it.
So you talk in your essay about 1.5 degrees a lot, and how it probably wasn't, it was a compromise anyways. I mean, Paris was 2 degrees, as you explain, and there was an aspirational note attached to it of 1.5 degrees to satisfy the island states, and you explain all this in your essay. But there's some very pragmatic reasons why 1.5 degrees wasn't going to work anyways. You talk about stranded assets and other things. What are those reasons, and what do you think the number is now?
So I hate to continually plug cleaning up, but the episode with Christiana Figueres is very enlightening. She was the head of the UNFCCC after the Copenhagen failure and through to Paris and at Paris. And in fact, there's interviews with another great one to understand what happened there, is with Catherine McKenna, who was actually your environment minister, Canadian environment minister at the time, and she was very involved in brokering that deal with the small island nations that said, look, it says 2 degrees. For us, the small island, if you're a Vanuatu, then 2 degrees is a suicide note, because the amount of sea level rise that you're going to see means that you won't have a country. So we need, if you want us to sign this thing, then we need to have an aspiration at the very least for 1.5 degrees. And so that's the compromise that you talked about. And Catherine was instrumental in that. So that's where it came from. But the 2 degrees is the sort of binding, in a sense, and nothing's binding, but is the hard target, and the aspiration is the 1.5. There was no body of science to say what actually happens. They'd all been, putting all of their computer runs, using all their resources on RCP 8.5, and nobody had really looked at RCP, I think it's 1.9 or 1.6 or something that, that right down at the other end of the scale, what happens if you get close to really solving this? And so then the IPCC moderated, lots of researchers started to work, and then they did a report. The IPCC produced a report in 2018 called SR15, SR15, 1.5 degrees, I think it was. So SR15, and SR is special report. They produced it. It took them 3 years to put it all together. And it said, as you'd expect, if we can keep the warming to 1.5 degrees, it is a whole hell of a lot better than 2 degrees, or of course than RCP 8.5, the fantasy, worst scenario. So on the one hand, everybody glommed onto it and said, wow, look at all these differences. It really does make a difference to get to 1.5 versus 2. And nobody sensible would have any, issue with that. But in that report, they also said, what would you need to do? And what you would need to do, the one that got picked up and enshrined, is reducing fossil fuel emissions, reducing emissions by 45% from 2018 to 2030. 45% reduction. And now, I don't know about you, but that to me translates fairly easily into thoughts of stranded assets, right? Because that is essentially putting a wrecking ball through about half of your existing energy infrastructure, because we're not going to stop building, a bit more. You can sort of do the maths any way you want, but if you really want to be at 45% below within 12 years, some of it is very old and is going to be retired gracefully and put out to graze. But a lot of it is stuff that is actually highly productive that we're supposed to not be using anymore. And we might build a bit more, but then even that the more you build, the more you've got a problem and you have to strand the old stuff. So 1.5 degrees, and you have to do it globally. That wasn't 45% reduction for just Europe or just America or just Japan, just the advanced economies. That was global. The other thing buried in the SR15 report was an analysis of the marginal impact on carbon prices, because obviously we're not just going to use carbon markets to do all of this. There's lots of regulations and different ways that are more politically acceptable around the world. But nevertheless, even if you do it through a regulation that says the next time your boiler goes, you have to use a heat pump, that also has a carbon price. You can calculate, is it a positive, negative, big, small, and so on. And 1.5 degrees, in that 2018 report, the marginal carbon price that you would need, or that would be consistent with 2 degrees, the old plan in a sense, was $225 per ton of CO2. The new one for 1.5 degrees was $6,050, up to $6,050. Right now at $6,050, we're talking about flights are unaffordable. I don't need to tell you, I think, that the average person doesn't need to know a single thing about RCP 8.5, and definitely won't. And they don't need to know a single thing about whether it was SR15 report or whatever, or about the marginal carbon price. But when you look at those sorts of costs, any sensible person will go, wait, so you want me to destroy half of my energy infrastructure and do a whole bunch of unbelievably expensive things? I'm out. And I did that. And I said, it's not going to happen. Go through the motion, try, aspire, look at what it would take, see if you can innovate, But don't be under any illusion that 1.5 is not going to happen. And I said that in 2018, almost as soon as that report came out. But the politicians around the world, they all got sort of bounced into it by Fridays for Future and the Sunrise Movement, and the Extinction Rebellion suddenly became this trendy thing that we would all, support and so on. And without really understanding the economics of what was being said, the economics and the politics, because if you did it, the economics would be catastrophic. And if you're not intending to do it, then the politics are catastrophic, because you get this kind of, you're sanctimonious, but you're not really even intending to deliver. And then, of course, what happens? You get the pushback. Back to point number one of the Pragmatic Climate Reset. You've said a whole bunch of stupid things, and you're not even delivering on, it's manifest that you're not delivering. So you're not credible. You're saying stupid things and you're not credible. And you're not, so you lose your competence. You can no longer be seen as competent or sincere. And of course, I'm sitting here in the UK, and the Conservative Party, which presided over that period, is not seen as sincere and competent, and which I find tragic. That's my party that I may now need to leave, because I refuse to swing the other way and say, well, in that case, we should get rid of the whole lot of it. Now we can be seen as competent and sincere. Well, hang on a second. How about we do a pragmatic climate reset? We say we do need to deal with climate change, but we're going to do it in a way which is both faster and more, and it's both faster and more affordable, or fast and affordable, as opposed to this kind of magical thinking, which everybody fell for in the past.
I think that was one of the things that really attracted me to your essay on this and got me pretty excited about doing this story. Is you used to say that there was no role for, I think you said this, there was no role for gas in the future. And now in your Pragmatic Climate Reset, you talk about flexibility and how it can make it a lot easier to get most of the way to our goal. Talk about perfection and this new pragmatism.
Right. So let me say, first of all, I want to make it very, very clear. What I'm not advocating for is slowing down. I'm not advocating for slowing down. The Pragmatic Climate Reset is not saying, the system, everything we said is right, but we have to do it much more slowly. Right? It's not about the same but slower. And that's really important, because what I think it is not a manifesto, but it is saying, if you want to go fast, this thing is a system, and I'm going to tell you how to get that system to go as fast as possible, right? So the old theory of change is you make more noise, you push harder, you capture more politicians, you go for 51%. You can, as long as you win the presidency, it doesn't matter by how small you win, because then you have the kind of the keys to the magic kingdom and all the hands on the levers, and you can do this, right? That is the old theory of change. And I'm saying that then you get the pushback, and that's the slow method. That's transition like a hare. Transition like a tortoise is actually the fastest available. I mean, the tortoise wasn't just slow, the tortoise won the race. That's the important bit, won the race. So what I'm talking about is how fast can you go? And the thinking about gas is that, we've had gas promoted as a transition fuel, right? And I know that in Canada, you have wonderful, gas producers, and this narrative is not news to Canadians and not to anybody really around the world. And that thinking is, the one that I objected to is, you've got a coal-fired power station, it's big and inflexible, and by the way, causes lots of asthma and respiratory deaths, as well as being, appalling for the climate. Just swap it for a gas-fired power station. Really efficient, beautiful CCGT, combined cycle gas turbine, very efficient. And this thing will hum away, replaces the coal like for like, and you've cut your emissions by half. What's not to like? And the reason I've been raising the alarm about that is, what's not to like is it locks you in. Because you've then got this CCGT, a very expensive piece of kit. Expensive means you need to run it lots of hours. If you really want it to be cheap, as it's claiming, you have to run it lots of hours. But if you run it lots of hours, you have to buy the gas, number one, that hits the economics, and of course it still emits. So what you really want is flexibility. So if you swap that coal for flexible gas, Then what you've got, by flexible, I mean gas turbines that you can switch on and off. They're a bit less efficient, but they don't stand in the way. When you've got lots of wind and lots of solar, you're not saying, I'm terribly sorry, Mr. Wind Turbine, you can't run, Mr. Solar Panel, you can't produce electricity. You have to go open circuit and waste your electricity because we've got this CCGT that needs to run because we've promised the owners that they wouldn't build it unless we gave them precedence in the what they call the dispatch order. So instead of doing that, you have flexible gas, and there's a few conditions that I set on it. It has to be flexible, right? It has to be able to turn up and down to make way nicely for the wind and solar or whatever else demand response, energy efficiency that can be delivered. The second thing is the regulatory environment has to allow the owners to earn their money whether it runs or not. There's no point building it and then having the owners say, now we're going to lobby or now we're going to insist we're not going to build it unless we get to run it for 3,000 hours, 5,000 hours a year or whatever. You want it to run as little as possible. So have a regulatory framework, and you can do that with, you can either put it into what's called the regulated asset base and let the owners earn money based on how much money they've invested, nothing to do with how many hours, or you can have things like capacity payments. So, David, we're going to pay you to have this power station, keep it on standby, and then, it doesn't matter. You don't care whether it runs or not. By the way, if it is on standby, part of flexibility is that you can split the generator from the bit that generates, from the engine. It could be a turbine, could be a reciprocating engine. You can split it with a clutch. And that's very important. It's kind of engineering geeky, but what it means is that the generator, when you don't need power from this thing, because it's windy and sunny, you don't need the power, but you can keep the generator spinning. You can even add more inertia. You can add a flywheel to it. And now it's keeping the grid stable. What it's doing is it's keeping the frequency correct, and it can deal with all the other things that a grid needs in order to not do what, by the way, Spain and Portugal did in April and go dark. So the flexibility, even if your regulation says don't run it all the time, you can still provide those services all the time. The third condition, my third condition, is that you've got to deal with upstream fugitive methane emissions, right? Natural gas, mainly methane, it's a ferocious greenhouse gas itself. If you have 3 or 4% losses in the when the gas is being extracted or transported or cleaned up or whatever, then you might as well not bother, stick with coal at that point. So it's got to be, you've got to deal with that. It's a big problem. We've got to deal with it around the world. Can it be done? Yes, because we know that it's done in the North Sea Basin. It can be done. It has to be done. In fact, some of the players in the US even are making good progress. Fourth condition is that it's got to be affordable. It's got to be affordable. You've got to, whatever system it is, you can't just be, well, that stands to reason because there is a new focus on affordability. And there's a few other, things that have to happen to enable. Now, what does that do? A small amount of flexible gas can enable a lot of clean energy. So I went to Chile. This is where one of the places I had my epiphany on this. They have 25% coal, big, obviously emitting, etc., but inflexible plants that provide 25% of the power into the market with the best solar and the best wind in the world. How can that be? And the electricity price is dropping to zero across the country, north, all the way from the north to the south, which is very, very far. It's thousands and thousands of miles. Why? The coal has to run to provide those stability services. And those great big old coal-fired power stations can't be cycled up and down when it's windy or sunny. Now, there's a company called Wärtsilä that I've got to know very, very well who make reciprocating gas engines. They've run the absolutely standard energy models, the same as everybody has, the same models, and say, well, what would happen if you had flexible gas? How much of it would you need? And the answer is you'd need not as much as 25% capacity like the coal has. You would need less than that, let's say half of that, 12% capacity, but you wouldn't use it all the time. You would use it 4% of the time. So you've gone from 25% coal to 4% gas. It's a huge, colossal climate win, huge, colossal, right? But if you say no gas, then you end up, well, what do? You start thinking about how many batteries or very expensive things like hydrogen, all sorts of things and then you, of course, have to have a huge discussion about how you're going to fund them and where's that going to come from. And also the gas industry now has, or the fossil industry has no part in the future. So if you want to get an allergic reaction, that's a really good way to go about, getting the most pushback possible. So that's what I'm saying with gas. Under my conditions, it is possible to, and there is the fifth condition is no gas in the community, right? Everything I'm talking about would involve gas on either the high pressure or the medium pressure grid. So you can have these are big engines providing electricity, big turbines still. So they're not in the high street. They're not on the forecourt, because what you've got is the gas industry, the gas distribution industry is fighting because it has got these pipes in many countries in the world. They've got pipes in the ground going to houses, going to high streets, going to shops, going to small manufacturers. And that stuff, there's just no role for it. So the fifth condition is don't do anything that encourages people to think you're ever going to have, gas or hydrogen heating. You're not. You're going to have electrical heating.
So what you're saying is this pragmatism changes the whole affordability picture and the doability.
Correct. Yes, and the affordability, to finish on that, if you look at any of these scenarios for decarbonizing the grid, as I say, your heating is going to be electric, your transport is going to be electric. The vast bulk of what we do in that, whether it's 2100, 2070, or the mythical unicorn of 2050, total decarbonization globally, electrification plays a huge role. We go from 20, 30% of the economy is being electrified to 60, 70, 80, 90%. It's the only way to get there. But then you need a clean grid. And what happens is, this is also part of the pragmatic sort of reset, is that the cleaning up the grid, which used to be seen as easy because all you needed to do is replace coal with gas and improve the efficiency of the gas turbines, bring in some coal, bring in some solar, you can clean the grid. And, in the UK, nuclear, by the way, sorry, I apologize. I've not used the word nuclear yet. I'm good with nuclear. I think it'll be very expensive, but I'm good with it. We're now at 60% clean electricity in the UK. And, but when you chart the cost of decarbonizing, or the cost of electricity in a decarbonized system, so as you get more and more, you get cleaner and cleaner, the cost sort of stays pretty flat. It doesn't cost that much. As you reach asset life cycle ends, you replace things and so on. When you get to the last 10%, it goes almost vertical. So what I'm saying is, why bother with the last 10%? We are so far from that last 10%. We've got this smorgasbord of opportunities in front of us because we can decarbonize what we've got. And by the way, if we electrify, right, if we electrify heating and transport, then we have to generate more power. Well, whatever you add to the grid, add clean. And again, that will drive that, that's not going to drive your costs up. The grid, the interesting thing about electrification is it's the gift that keeps on giving, because by putting more demand into the grid, people say, oh, but the grid can't cope, and then we'll have to invest in the grid. It's like, yes, but you know what? If you have to have a grid that's twice as big, it doesn't cost twice as much. It might cost 30% as much. So now you've got more electricity and the denominator has grown, right? You've doubled the electricity demand, but you've only added 30% to the cost of the bit in the middle, which is, by the way, about half of our electricity bills. So the more we electrify, the cheaper the electricity gets. Not the more expensive, the cheaper. And this is totally not in the debate, right? Everybody thinks bigger grid must be more expensive. Not only, but the gift that keeps on giving, when you electrify transport, you end up with a load of batteries. When you electrify heat and heating, you end up with a load of thermal storage capacity. I mean, you've done, how many is it now? 400 and how many episodes on how useful that stuff is, right? In the energy system, having a load of batteries, smart charging, maybe vehicle to grid, thermal storage, allowing people to say, oh, power prices are going to drop to near zero on Tuesday next week, and you make sure that you take advantage of it because of the weather conditions. So all of that electrification creates a bigger denominator and creates flexibility. And so you have this virtuous circle where the more you electrify, the cheaper the electricity gets. And then the next person says, well, I'm an idiot. Why haven't I done this? When they do it, the next person. So you get this virtuous electrification circle. And is this theoretical? No, they're doing it in China, right? This is the way that China is moving. And it's gone from a lower electrification rate than Europe and the US, in half of the electrification rate in 1990 to 50% ahead of us now. And it's taking off because the more you electrify, the cheaper it gets.
You've just reminded me of another key point you make, which is actually one of my pet peeves as well. And that is people talk about the energy transition is going to cost us trillions. Well, it might, but it's going to cost us trillions. But you differentiate, and I think this is really important, between investment and cost.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, that's one of those things. Whenever I see the words primary energy, I immediately have this kind of klaxon goes, oh, wait a minute, because that's somebody trying to talk about how many lumps of coal we're shoveling, not the fact that if you have a light bulb powered by your solar rooftop, you're using 5% of the primary energy of that lump of coal in a coal-fired power station and a filament light bulb. So I have this word, primary energy. It's like immediately I'm on sort of fight or flight mode, and that's also what you talk about there is again it's cost. It's another of those words. If you hear somebody talking about the cost of the transition, then I get this kind of fight or flight response because generally they're talking about investment. And not only that, they're talking about investment against a base case of not investing. So they're talking about how many trillions it would take to replace all the cars in Germany with electric cars. Yeah, sure, fine. But you know what? That probably wouldn't be trillions, but it would be hundreds of billions. But of course, Germans are going to replace their cars anyway, right? So what you've got to compare it to is a situation where they're investing in internal combustion cars, which, by the way, will have no resale value and will be using a fuel that continues to cost the same amount and to emit the same amount throughout its life. Comparing that to a vehicle that is, a technology with a learning curve and a fuel that gets cleaner and cleaner and cleaner over time. And this stuff really matters. In the UK, we have the Climate Change Committee, and that is set up as part of the Climate Change Act 2008. Actually, my co-host on Cleaning Up, Baroness Worthington now, was the lead author on it. So that resulted in the Climate Change Committee, and they have to produce scenarios, and they have to cost what they're doing. Well, until now, they've stopped that calculation in 2050. So after 2050, if we get to net zero in the UK, which the law says we need to do, we wouldn't be buying any gas or any coal or any oil for other than petrochemicals or whatever for uses that are permanently sequestering the CO2 and or offset some other way. So we're not buying, but the point is we're not buying any fuel. And so after 2050, we're going to have a system which is going to have a very big grid, a lot of electricity being generated domestically, and then presumably a whole bunch imported via interconnections with other countries. From Morocco, there was a thing called X-Links, which this government has said they don't want to do, but in the end, we're going to have to do. But there's no fuel cost. And so the benefits keep going forever, or, you can repower and there'll need to be reinvestment and so on. But the narrative about cost is entirely benighted, and intentionally by the Contrarians, to give them their proper name, who want to emphasize what they call the cost, which is not the cost, it's the investment requirement. Now, the corollary is the capital markets have got a huge investment challenge because instead of what we used to do, which was have a whole bunch of oil companies and the sort of running costs of the system that being paid back with a certain term, you've got all this investment up front, right? You've got whether it's renewables, whether it's the grid, whether it's nuclear. By the way, I'm okay with nuclear, or if it's energy efficiency, or if it's infrastructure, or if it's adaptation, or if it's public transport, most of the costs are up front. So the whole challenge of the transition, not the whole challenge, the economic challenge, the macroeconomic challenge is how do we make sure that the interest rates are low enough to enable that pump priming of a system which is low fuel cost or no fuel cost. This is something I've been working on for 22 years now, trying to educate people to understand that an investment is not a cost, but you also have to kind of figure out where it's going to come from, which pools of capital everywhere in the world are going to be used to actually deliver it.
It's interesting because your co-host Bryony was talking to a guest from India, and she was making the point, and I thought this was really interesting, on energy security. So she was talking about, well, you guys rely on these countries for all your oil products, and you rely on one country for all your solar and wind products. But her point was the fuel. Back to the fuel. Like when you buy a product, you got to buy oil tomorrow, the day after, the next week, the week after, the week after that. When you buy a solar panel or a solar module, it's good for 25 years. You're not buying fuel tomorrow. It's going to come out of the sky. But that's not what I want to ask you about, because we're getting near the end here. And I know I really hesitate to open this area because I know it's one of your favorites. You also gave your co-host heck the other day for not asking a guest about the cost of hydrogen. And so you refer to hydrogen as the hydrogen souffle. So Michael, in brief, tell us why hydrogen is problematic.
So green hydrogen is problematic. So I did this thing, which I'm sure you'll have come across, many of your audience might as well, called the hydrogen ladder, where I tried to reverse the narrative from people just saying, well, hydrogen could do everything, and therefore we need to produce huge amounts of it. And I reversed it to say, what are we going to use it for? Because in real life, a solution has to beat the next best alternative to work. And what I showed was that if you look at a taxi, we're never going to have hydrogen taxis, because an electric taxi does the job, does it better, does it cheaper, is available now, done. So I went through all these different use cases. And what you've got is some uses of hydrogen we can't get rid of, which are like it's the top of the ladder, which would be things like petrochemicals, so hydrocracking and so on, and also fertilizers. And then there's a bunch of other things, very difficult to electrify, steel and aviation fuels and so on. And people think the fact that there's some things at the top we have to do means green hydrogen, and that's not the case, right? Because green hydrogen, even if you had to do hydrogen, is going to be in competition with, well, first of all, biofuels, biosolutions, and secondly, blue, so hydrogen from fossil fuels with the carbon captured and sequestered. So you've got two problems for green hydrogen, which are, I've reached a point now where I'm like, okay, none of it makes sense. And the two problems are, number one, it's expensive. It's, we're not going to get to the $1 per kilo that everybody kind of got excited and said, well, the learning curve will get us to $1 a kilo. We're not at $1. The best places in the world are at about 4. They claim 3. Some of them claim 2, but I don't believe them. And the problem with hydrogen is green hydrogen does not have the learning curve of solar or batteries. The electrolyzers, the actual stack will 100% get very, very cheap. But a hydrogen plant, green hydrogen plant, is a chemicals plant. Go and have a look at one. It's got tanks and pipes, and it's got a substation, and it's got compressors and flangers. And by the way, it has to have things like blast walls because hydrogen, and so on. So it's a chemicals plant, and the feedstock is electricity. So if you've got a 3, 5, 10 times cost problem, and you want the learning curve to deal with it, but the learning curve is electricity going to get 3, 5, or 10 times cheaper? I don't think so. Are compressors going to get 3, 5, or 10 times cheaper? I don't think so. Are pipelines going to get 3, 5, 10 times cheaper? Well, I know some pipeline operators in Canada would be pleased to hear it, right? And so you've not got this rapid cost reduction. So one problem green hydrogen has is it's out of the money. It needs $200, $300, $400, $500 per ton carbon prices to make sense, and doesn't have a prospect to get those down. Not enough. It'll get them down, but not by enough. The second reason, though, is that every single kilowatt hour that you use to make green hydrogen today, you could use that electricity directly and have between 2 and 9 times the impact on emissions. I'll give you a very concrete example. Everfuel, Nova Scotia, right? They want to take wind power and they want to make ammonia and then ship it to Germany. Nova Scotia, 35% of their power is from coal and another 15% from natural gas. So do the wind, get the electricity and use it. Boom, finished, basta, yabasta, as I could say. And the reason is it would be cheaper, right? You don't have to build electrolysis. You don't have to deal with the intermittency and into the electrolyzer, which would probably require either batteries or buffering downstream or some horrible thing you have to do to run. Then the next thing you have to build, which is the Haber-Bosch process to turn that hydrogen into ammonia. Then you don't need the pipeline or infrastructure to the port, and you don't need the ship, and you don't need to deal with ammonia at the other side, trying to turn it back into electricity in Germany. You get rid of all of that. You take your wind power from those beautiful wind turbines that you could build in Nova Scotia, and you use it to clean up the Nova Scotia power mix. And by the way, when you're finished with that, you could clean up Nova Scotia transport, and you could clean up Nova Scotia heating, right? So that would have a vastly bigger impact on the climate for a vastly lower cost, or for only a small part of the cost. So green hydrogen, why? It's way too expensive, and every time you make any of it, you're preventing that green electricity from doing something that would be quicker in terms of emissions reduction. And finally on that, the order in which we do things is very important. Supposing you say, yes, but we have to get rid of aviation fuel. We have to use hydrogen eventually, so we should start. Hang on a second. Aviation fuel, using hydrogen for aviation fuel has something like 9 times less impact. So now my question is, which should we do? 9 units of emissions reduction today, and eventually 1 unit of emissions reduction at some point in the future when we really have so much green electricity we don't know what to do with it? Or should we do the 1 unit of decarbonization today by making an aviation fuel with the hydrogen, and leave the 9 units to 2 decades, 3 decades into the future? And emissions matter. The carbon, the CO2 builds up in the atmosphere. You want to do the 9 now, pragmatic climate reset. You do the 9 now, and if you have to, you do the 1 later. You don't reverse them under no circumstances.
Blue hydrogen, though, also relies on the promise of carbon capture and storage, which will only be done under regulation.
Well, David, obviously, because things that add cost, there has to be a reason to do them. Generally, that's going to be regulation. But the skepticism about blue hydrogen, I find, entirely, these people weeping crocodile tears for this project and that project. I mean, it's never been done right. We've tried to do post-combustion carbon capture and storage, and we haven't funded it. You need to fund both the building and you need to fund the parasitic load, the ongoing cost for the long term. And if you build a steam methane reforming post-combustion system, yes, it's going to have a problem because the power stations are going to be switching off all the time to allow space for that lovely wind and solar. So your carbon capture and storage your carbon capture is going to be switched off all the time. It makes no sense, never made any sense. It was thoroughly benighted and stupid to start with. What we need to do for blue hydrogen is something called autothermal reforming, where you capture all of the carbon. You can capture the CO2. There's other things. You can also do pyrolysis. You can do different methods, capture either the CO2 or carbon as a solid, and you can run it 24/7, which those processors, high temperature processors, actually like, as opposed to objecting to being switched on and off. So all the people who say we can't do carbon capture and storage and blue hydrogen, you've got the hydrogen users today are fertilizer companies, i.e. chemicals companies, and petrochemicals companies. And saying that their engineers are incompetent to do carbon capture. I mean, that is not something I'd like to go to Alberta and say in a bar. They can do this. You just have to pay them or regulate them or they have to be not made. Essentially either an incentive or a regulation, and just watch what those fabulous engineers can do. Just watch.
Okay, as we get towards the end here, Michael, I want to thank you for your time. But you talk about, in spite of all the stuff we just talked about, which, not all that super positive always, but you say the energy transition is doing very well, thank you. So let's end on our super positive note and give me your best shot at why you think it's doing well and what's doing well.
So that's a tough question, because what I actually say, particularly in part one of the Pragmatic Climate Reset, is not that it's doing fabulously well and actually that you can't prove that it's not doing well. Technically, my little 4-line model shows that you can't say it's failed because, frankly, the geometric growth that happens in 2045 that I'm relying on hasn't happened yet. I mean, it's consistent with what's happening now. So, but I think that we are very close to peak emissions. We've had the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which enormously pushed up gas prices, which pushed a lot of people back to coal, particularly in China. So I think that what we're actually going to see, if the gas prices drop, and by the way, there could be a glut of LNG, which is another whole topic for your Canadian audience. You're now putting a lot of political capital into trying to export and get into the LNG business, perhaps at exactly the wrong moment of the cycle. But I think that we're pretty much at peak emissions. And when you look at the acceleration of those clean technologies, I have a business providing charging for electric trucks in Europe, which we can do cheaper than diesel on certain routes and certain countries today, enough to start a business. But the trucks are only going to get cheaper. They're only going to get longer range. And so that business, and freight is 10% of European emissions. So I've got line of sight with a business that I've created to address, my addressable market is 10% of European emissions. It's the entire freight industry in Europe. How can you not be optimistic with all of the tailwinds are behind us? So, you look at what's happening in Asia, you look at how China is exporting now, not just to Europe, the volume of exports of solar panels into Africa, into Pakistan. Pakistan, over the last 2 years, imported enough solar panels to add 50% to the size of its grid. 50% in 2 years, well, actually 18 months. So there's an extraordinary amount going on. We have huge, huge challenges, over-dependence on China in that case. But the idea that we would step back from what I would consider to be the completely inevitable future energy tech stack would be ludicrous. Would be ludicrous. And of course, that is unfortunately what the US is trying to encourage us to do. It's entirely wrong.
So you did say, though, that you gave some basic stats in your article about EVs, and I think you said they were 1 in 5 purchases. I can't remember the number you used. And you talked about solar, and let's end on this. You talked about solar being able to maintain a growth rate and probably being one of the top technologies, probably the number one source of energy in the future. But it going fast enough to overcome the growth rate in demand for electricity and eventually squeezing out fossil fuels. So let's end with that. Explain why you think that can happen.
Right. So just on the EV stats, 1 car in 2 in China, 1 car in 5 in the rest of globally. And by the way, the figures for Europe, everybody talked last year about, there's an EV slowdown. It was all total, nonsense. We're actually now at something like 1 in 4, around 1 in 4 cars in Europe is electric. Can I just take the time to share my favorite statistics on cars, which is the Nissan Leaf?
Please.
So the guy behind that, Andy Palmer, came on Cleaning Up. And so I'm a big fan of the Nissan Leaf, which he was created when he was at Nissan. And the Nissan Leaf 1 was launched in 2011. and we've now got the Nissan Leaf 3, which will be launching in 2026. And what happened between the 1 and the 6? The 1 launched with 75-mile range. The Nissan, so the 2026 model, so the 3, I think I called it the 6 by mistake. So the Nissan Leaf 1 had a 75-mile range. The 3 has a over 300-mile range, 4 times the range. But it also has twice the power, so it drives nicer. It has 3 times the charging speed. It's done all of that with a battery that's only, I think the battery is 3 times as big, but 2 or 3 times as big, but it's got 4 times the range. And get this, it's 2/3 of the price. So when you get 4 times the range at 2/3 the price, your dollar per mile or kilometer of range in the car that you're buying has gone up by 6. It's quite extraordinary. And we're only in 2020, that's only the 2026 model. What do you think the 2040 model will be like? What do you think the trucks we're buying today, big Daimler e-Actros 600s, very expensive, what do you think they're going to cost in 2040? Right? So you want an optimistic view. Have a look at the model specs of the Nissan Leaf 1, the Nissan Leaf 3. In terms of the growth rates of solar, as I put into my little model, which is not a forecast, it's an illustration, the question that I would ask, I would leave you with is, can you have clean energy, the whole lot of it, renewables, bio, nuclear, the waste heat, all of the things that are zero carbon ways of providing the energy services that we need, can we just keep that lot growing at 5% per year? The output of that lot growing at 5% per year. Because if we can, that will be faster, even with AI data centers and everything. We're staring down the barrel of this huge, increase in demand for data centers, by the way, from a very small start. We'll be able to meet all of that clean if we can keep it growing at 5% per year. And I think manifestly we can. And solar is going to be an absolutely monstrous contributor to that, because solar, a lot of the models, when you look at the models, IEA, EIA, McKinsey, DNV, all of those people, they all sort of put in a caveat deep in the model. They say things like, well, the sun doesn't shine at night, and so we better not have more than 10% of electricity coming from solar, maybe 20% if we are really progressive. Bloomberg NEF, I'm sure somewhere has some kind of a rate limiter or whatever. But when you take the brakes off and you say, but hang on a second, it's just wires and batteries to move that power around. And a lot of the demand in the global south is not 5 nines resilience grid, right? If you talk about those billions of people that will be in Africa, they're coming from no grid or very poor grids, right? Even in a country like Turkey, they have power cuts. So when we say, I'm saying just use those gas peakers for the last 5 or 10%. In a big chunk of the world, even if there are power outages or a bit of, they're not going for perfection. That's why Pakistan, why did people buy all those solar panels? It's not because it gives them bulletproof 100% 5 nines, 6 nines power. It's because it's a whole lot cheaper and more resilient than the grid, which was not coping. And so we're going to see, continued very, very rapid growth in solar without question. And now in the West, we've decided we don't like wind because it's unsightly and it's this and it's that. Well, do you know what? Somebody should tell China, India, Southeast Asia, Latin America, and I've absolutely no doubt Africa, because wind, it's cheap, it works, it doesn't correlate, it anti-correlates to a certain extent with solar, and it's just a fantastic resource. If you are stuck on a fossil grid and somebody offers you a wind turbine, thank you very much. So can we grow faster than 5%? Yes. And will that eventually achieve the transition? It will.
Canada has lots of solar and will have lots of solar, but it may have more wind in the long run just because of our latitude, interestingly. And by the way, Nova Scotia their latest thing is they're looking at offshore wind, which would be the first offshore wind in Canada. surprisingly.
It's a bit expensive, but because it clearly costs
Yes.
more than onshore. But we've surprised ourselves with how cheap it could be if it's done right and it feeds into a grid that's well prepared, etc. So I wish them enormous good luck with that.
So let's end with, I believe you said the energy transition is dead, long live the energy transition, or the transition is dead, long live the transition. That would be an awesome way to end.
Transition, like a hare, is dead. The 1.5 degree transition is dead. Transition, like a tortoise, slow and steady, grow clean energy 5% per year forever, or more if you can, absolutely. So transition, like a tortoise, is absolutely not dead. So the transition is dead, but long live the transition.
I really love the way you address this stuff. And I think the pragmatism, it's funny because I did notice you backing off a little bit from the drama of your pragmatism because you're so committed to the transition today, if I may make the observation. But I really do enjoy what you have to say. And I think this is very thought-provoking. And, especially to me, the most important part is the pragmatism around our goals. And, if we can get to 90% and we can do that super affordably and fairly quickly, I believe what you said is we'll sort out the last 5% or whatever, there's lots of time for that.
So two things very briefly. One is you and I are of a certain age. We were never going to see net zero globally, right? Most likely. There need to be some medical miracles. But if we could live in a world, if we could finish our careers and maybe enjoying our retirement, tracking the trends, if it's a 95% or a 90% or even an 80% clean global economy, I think we could be able to pat ourselves on the back and say, good job. The other thing is just leave you with a challenge, maybe a thought for future guests and issues to grapple with. How do you wind your head back from an overambitious target? It's been perfectly good to focus on 1.5 degrees. It's made everybody think hard about technologies and business models and political allies and alliances and so on. But how do you as a leader and as an organization say, well, that was then, but now I've got this other target, but now I'm really, really serious and we're going to do it. And here's the reasons why it's doable, because that Liebreich guy, is right and so on. But the process of winding back from a target without losing credibility, to me, that's one of the big challenges that we've got over the next couple of years.
I really appreciate you taking the time to do this. I will try to milk this the best I can because I think it's really important for us to have these conversations. And, I just think it's so important that we rethink how we do this. And I think you've laid out a thought process for wrapping our heads around it and taking a slightly different approach and trying to achieve the same ends, but in a more reasonable way.
Well, thank you very much, David. And you are now officially Team Reset.
Okay, I'm in. Okay, thanks, Michael. We've been speaking with Michael Liebreich about his ideas for a pragmatic climate reset. Please check out our blog at greenenergyfutures.ca for more information, links, and our CKUA radio podcasts. We've produced more than 400 stories on the energy transition, mostly good news stories about the amazing things some very amazing people are doing to build a clean energy future. Don't forget to subscribe and hit notifications. For Green Energy Futures, I'm David Dodge.